Today we have the troubled period of Rome, what's called the Roman Revolution, a period of trouble in Rome. This is the period of from 133 to 31 BC. It's this 100-year period here where Rome looks like it's collapsing, and the problem is it's becoming an empire. So there's trouble in what is called an empire. It's technically a republic. The government's a republic, but it probably should become an empire. They're running the entire Mediterranean based on a government that is meant to control the city of Rome. So the problem here is the success. Rome is just a victim of its own success. It is so great. It's taken over almost the entire Mediterranean Sea. The effects of this is that it controls trade. If you put a cart on the road or you put a boat in the water, the Romans are going to be there to patrol it. And it actually improves everything. The Romans are good at controlling trade all through the Mediterranean. Literally, all roads lead to Rome. At some point, all these goods that are on the roads are going to deal with Romans. You're going to run into a Roman at some point controlling traffic and, of course, taxing. And this leads to great wealth for the Romans. The Romans just could never even conceive of this small Italian town taking over the peninsula, taking over the western Mediterranean, now taking over the eastern Mediterranean, and the wealth is just unbelievable in this, the amount of wealth rolling into the Romans. And also the amount of slaves. We haven't talked too much about it, but every time they win a war, there's going to be masses of slaves coming in, and they're just winning war after war after war and taking territory after territory, and they just have their fill of slaves. Unbelievable numbers of slaves rolling in. Also, they start bumping into the Greeks, and we talked about them taking over Greece. They love it. They love what they experienced there. Now, they had bumped into Greeks before in the peninsula of Italy. There were Greeks, but now they really get into it. They really it becomes a craze among the Romans to adopt Greek culture. Everything Greek becomes in. The architecture, when Romans build their buildings now, and they will have the wealth to build them and the slaves to build them, they will be gigantic, but based on Greek architecture style. When they start doing art, they'll be copying the Greeks. They will want Greeks to show them how to do proper art. And then drama also. They will just love the Greek drama. And it continues in everything pretty much. From philosophy, they will become just immersed in Greek philosophy. By this point, the Greeks are into Epicureanism, Stoicism, and the Romans will just eat this up, this Greek philosophy. And then they'll start doing history. It's at this time that the Romans will start writing their history, or any history of anything, based on the way that the Greeks do it. And it just goes on and on. Anything Greek is picked up by the Romans. Maybe not all Romans, but definitely high society, the upper echelons of Roman society, just eat up everything that's Greek. So the prize actually becomes Greek slaves. If you can get your hands on a Greek slave, this will be like gold back in Rome. People will just flock to have a Greek slave and be taught by Greek slaves. I don't want to make you misunderstand something about slavery, that all slavery would be wonderful. You must, if you were a Greek, you might be prized, but there could also be the death sentence. All these slaves are going to be rowing boats also. And so if you would like to see a movie about this, the evils of Roman slavery, you can see Ben-Hur, about a Jewish man who's enslaved, and he is sent to die on a galley. And then eventually, I won't give the whole story away, but eventually he is actually adopted by his slaveholder. So, it could go from the worst type of slavery to the good type of slavery, where you could actually be freed and adopted. But looking back look at Roman culture here, this Hellenization of Rome, having Greek teachers. If you were a wealthy Greek man, you would want your son educated by Greeks now. And so they will import these Greeks, and of course some of them might be slaves, but you want your son educated now in the Greek fashion, the sophist way of teaching, with rhetoric, and maybe some of the ideas of Plato and Aristotle in there too. And they just copy the Greeks in every way. And of course they also improve upon it. The Romans always start by copying and then adapt and then improve on things. And so high society will just be one of copying the Greeks, but in a Roman sort of fashion. They do make improvements. Again, whenever they adopt something, they will adapt it and improve it. Especially you see it in architecture. When the Romans start building Roman buildings in the Greek fashion, they'll be gigantic. And the Romans can build things better. They're just better builders than the Greeks, but they love the way that the Greeks had done this with the triangular roofs and the columns out front. And what the Romans have that lets them build giant buildings now is going to be concrete. This ability to mix these ingredients together to make stone any way they want it. You don't have to have stone and carve it. You can just cast it in any fashion you want, and using iron rebar to make it even stronger. So just the Roman concrete will make for massive buildings, which are still around today. You know, stones can be moved around, but concrete's not going anywhere. And they even invented a type of concrete that you could pour underwater. So when they want to cast a harbor, they can actually just pour the harbor where they want it, anywhere they want it. As far as history goes, this is the age of Alexandria, when the city of Alexandria was created by Alexander as a source of all knowledge. It's still around, and Romans will go there, and that's when they really get into Greek history. You know, they'll become fascinated with Alexander and all things Greek and all things Egyptian and Mesopotamian. They will just become fascinated with history and Roman history. And that's actually how we know a lot about Alexandria and past culture. Was these Romans will go there, copy things, bring it back to Rome, and that's how they will exist. It's kind of Alexandria eventually will burn down. The library will burn down, and we'll lose it all, except some of the parts that have been copied. As far as science goes, this will be a great age of science. The Greeks had continued on with their science, and the Romans will get into it also. The most famous name to mention is Archimedes. He actually was a Greek and had actually been killed by the Romans, but the idea is that it will continue on. The ideas of buoyancy and studying mathematically circles and buoyancy and levers. And then warfare. We'll come back to this in a second, but the Romans will actually, again, adopt Greek warfare with the phalanx and then improve upon it. The biggest change, however, is the word latifundia. This is a Latin word that you'll need to know, and the definition of it is plantations. The Romans get into plantation farming. And if you're a Southern American, you can be familiar with this. That we had this here in the South, the idea of giant farms with the labor done by slaves. Wealthy people massing real estate and having it worked by slaves. The same thing we had here in the South, you will see this in Rome, and the effects are pretty much the same. You'll see these people begin to just dominate the market. Once you can have massive amounts of farming done, not having to pay your labor, this will drop the price of food, which sounds good, and you drop the price of food, but it can run other farmers out of business. And when this happens, the wealthy will buy up those farms and continue on. The prices will continue to drop, and more farmers will lose their farms. Well, where do they go? They will move to the cities. As these rich people buy up the big farms, what used to be a nation of farmers now becomes a nation of city dwellers. The cities begin to grow and grow. And the problems are there also. When you move to these cities, you're going to experience all these big city problems now. Slums, as some of these Romans move there and they can't afford to live there and they can't find work. There is no work there for them because of slavery. And then also inflation. Once, with these wealthy Romans, once that causes price to go up, except maybe in the area of food. But where are you going to live? How are you going to live? You can't work because the slaves are doing that. And this is just, it's going to grow and grow and grow. By 200 and by 130, this is going to explode as these cities are just full of unemployed people wishing they had their farms back. So we're leading to revolution here. By 133, we're going to move to revolution. And the guys who will bring it to you are called the Gracchus brothers. It'll be two brothers back to back, and they're called the Gracchi. The plural of Gracchus is Gracchi, so we can sometimes refer to just both of them together as the Gracchi. But it's actually two, the older brother, and then 10 years later, the younger brother. Tiberius goes first, and then his younger brother will continue the crusade, Gracchus, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. In 133 BC, Tiberius leads it, and then 10 years later, Gaius will pick up the reins and lead this revolution again. They were actually wealthy Romans who appealed to the plebs. They understood the problems of the plebs, and so the plebs made them tribunes to take their problems to the Senate or to block Senate legislation. Their demand is for land reform. Can't you see what's happening here? You're driving these people off of their farms. You're loading up our cities with poor people. Can't you see the problem? We need land reform. Give us back our land. Return us to a nation of small farmers. And this sounds really great. And, when you read a history book, you're thinking, well, that's the way it needs to go. That you can obviously see the revolution coming, but of course, wealthy people are not going to turn back the clock and give back the land. And so you're going to have rioting as the people turn against the Senate. And what happens to the Gracchus brothers as they take their demands to the Senate? Well, the same thing will happen to both of them. One in 133 and one in 123. The Senate will assassinate them. We'll have its gang of thugs meet their gangs in the streets, and will assassinate the Gracchus brothers. First the older brother, and then the youngest brother. So what you've got now is the Senate taking action against popular revolt by violence. And now you have open warfare. You had poor people in the streets yelling for their rights and their land back, and the Senate's response is violence, and now you just have open warfare. By 133 and 123, you just have open warfare in the streets of several cities. Just raining hostility now. There are reports you can't even go outside. Senators are beaten. High-ranking Roman officials beaten in the streets. As the plebs refuse to go down quietly, they are going to just wage war. You've got open warfare in Rome. To make matters worse, you've got slave revolts. These thousands upon thousands of slaves do not go easily into this thing, and they will revolt. Lots and lots of slave revolts. There are many of them. It seems like year after year, somebody's having a revolt. And the Romans deal with this harshly. The idea is that you kill that slave and you kill anybody involved with it. In fact, you kill their families. The most famous of them is a guy named Spartacus, a Greek slave. He is a Greek from Thrace. Now this is up by Macedonia, and actually over near the Black Sea. So he is a Greek, but not from Athens or Sparta. So he's a Greek from up north, and he had been captured in the warfare. And then the Romans sent him to gladiator school. I think this should tell you something, that there are so many slaves now that you can just have them fight each other for fun. This originally began as a funeral rite. When a great Roman would die, you would have two slaves spill their blood over his grave. But now it becomes just for fun, just having masses of slaves kill each other for spectacle. And so Spartacus, being a former warrior, is sent to gladiator school to teach him to fight in a certain way. The Romans prefer their slaves to die in a certain fashion. And so he's sent to gladiator school, and there he leads a revolt. He gathers up these slaves who are armed and know how to fight, and they lead a revolt against the gladiator school, take over the school, and then go from latifundia to latifundia, from plantation to plantation, freeing the slaves. And again, a lot of these slaves know how to fight. I mean, they're healthy, not necessarily healthy, but they're armed and angry, and you've got now an army. He actually builds a slave army in Italy as he goes from plantation to plantation, freeing slaves and gathering an army. And he literally becomes just a savior figure to them, the man who's going to lead them out of slavery. When I was a kid, the best movie around was a movie called Spartacus, with Kirk Douglas playing the role. Kirk Douglas with his the hole in his chin, of Scottish descent, but he played Spartacus, and just the greatest movie back in the 50s and 60s or 70s when I was growing up. Great gladiator scenes of him, fighting and understanding and hating the Romans for watching violence. Lately, there's been a pretty good series called Spartacus, Blood and Sand. And I like the first few episodes when they're actually talking about who Spartacus was and showing the gladiator school. And then it kind of goes down from there. But if you'd like to get started in it, it's an interesting series. I will warn you, it's very raunchy in some places, a lot of nudity. But then again, the Romans didn't mind that, so it was actually kind of true to form. Spartacus, the revolt goes on. He actually defeated armies. Again, I'll remind you, the Romans don't always win, and in fact, they can't even defeat these armies here. Again, these aren't necessarily the best troops holding down Italy, and so the slave army versus Roman armies. Spartacus must have been a great leader and must have been very inspiring. At one point, he contacted pirates. Again, if you're in Italy and you want to get back to Greece, you're going to need to cross the water, and so he contacts pirates and hopefully get some boats. And they give the pirates all their money, and they wait for the pirates to pick them up. And the pirates never show up, sadly. And then eventually, in 71 BC, he is defeated. They actually finally corner him down in southern Italy, down around the ankle, and they corner him and defeat his army. And they don't even know who he is. He's such a minor person, nobody really knows who he is. And so the movie makes a great scene about this, where they have all these slaves, and they ask them, which one of you is Spartacus? We'll let you, you'll all die quietly, but if you tell us who Spartacus is, it'll go easier on you. And they all claim to be Spartacus. They would rather die than give away who Spartacus was. And the Romans don't play nice. The Romans crucify all of them. 6,000 slaves will be crucified along the streets of Italy, roads of Italy. Just the Romans don't. This is a terrifying event for them, and they want to make sure it doesn't happen again. So it appears that the Senate is pretty powerless in all this, as far as uprisings in the cities, slave revolts, and there's other things going on I'm not even getting into. It's a terrible time for Rome. Something's going to happen, and the answer appears to be a dictator. In a time of crisis, the Romans can turn to a dictator, one man to just make it happen, issue the orders. And in this case, they choose a guy named Marius. A little bit about him. He's from middle class, so he's not quite patrician, and he's not the poorest of the plebs. And he actually married up. He married a patrician woman, so that was, he's accepted by high society. He also was famous as a leader of the armies. He worked his way up through the ranks and began to lead armies and was successful, defeating armies in Africa.